There's so many potential topics to talk about these days that I'm hard pressed to select the best one, but this is the one that's up for me right now. And this is a work in progress. So what I say today is probably not going to be true tomorrow. So you'll just have to. When I'm thinking about any kind of group, my mind grabs that label and then makes that whole group inherently existent, of course. And then I come to all of these conclusions about the individuals in that group, and I see its disaster, especially with groups that are doing very negative things. And so I've gone back to a book that I got a few years ago. Someone gave me a certificate for Amazon, and I got the book by Mathieu Ricard on altruism. And I'm going back to this book because there's a lot of research in this book that's fascinating that I think pertains to what's going on in this country and many countries in many periods of time. So what I need to do so that I don't label someone and stick to it and just have this aversion for the person is I need to understand what is going on with that individual, not the group, but the individual. I need to understand this. And so in the case of a Nazi or a neo-Nazi, how in the world does a person end up in that kind of group? And Mathieu Ricard finds one story here that really points to what happens when we don't make informed decisions and when our mind is weak. And I don't know about you, but I have a weak mind all kinds of times, and I've seen instances across my life so far where I had a weak mind and I didn't act when I should, I didn't say something when I should have. So this is a very sobering story about what happened to one individual and how it snowballs. In fact, the subtitle of this section is called A Deadly Snowball Effect. So you might want to think about how this has shown up in your life after you hear this story. People who take a step on the path of barbarism are not always fully aware of crossing an unacceptable boundary, since they don't clearly apprehend the outcome of this path and think that a minor infringement of their sense of morality will not have any consequences. This initial base action is usually only the first stage of a cumulative snowball effect that becomes difficult to escape and then leads that individual to perpetrate increasingly seriously violent acts. That is how, because of external influences, and from a Buddhist point of view, internal influences, they don't dare or they don't know how to resist out of fear of weakness, out of fear or weakness. These individuals commit actions they would have refused to carry out if they had been asked to do so in another context. As the psychologist Roy Baumeister explains, once the members of the group are waist deep in blood, it's too late for them to question the group's project as a whole. So they are all the more likely to wade even deeper. So I think this story will explain how people get into groups partly and how they're bound to the group and they're imprisoned by the group, even though they're doing things that morally they know are awful. In a book called Such a Fragile Shell of Humanity, the philosopher Michael Tereshchenko demonstrates how one can let oneself get caught up in the snowballing effect of evil, or on the contrary, avoid engaging in it. He gives the example of Franz Stangl, who stage by stage becomes commandant of the Sobibor concentration camp, then of the Treblinka camp in Poland. His mind weak at each new appointment that advanced him further on the path of ignominy. Stangl hesitated and tried to evade the new responsibilities that would be his, but fear of reprisals for himself and his family, his submission to authority, and his lack of courage made it so that every time he gave in, he was sinking ever further into barbarism. What's shocking about this story is this is just a regular person, just trying to live a regular life. And then what happens is just shocking. After the war, Franz Stangl found refuge in Brazil, where he was finally arrested in 1967 and condemned in 1970 to life in prison for murdering 900,000 people. In 1971, he granted 70 hours, 70, of interviews to the historian Gita Sereni. The second day of their conversation, discussing the arrest of one of his former chiefs, who was tortured by the Germans, he suddenly declared, "I hate the Germans for what they pulled me into. I should have killed myself in 1938. That's when it started for me. I must acknowledge my guilt." It was only at the end of their interviews that Stangl again acknowledged his responsibility and said to Sereny, "I have never intentionally hurt anyone myself." And then after a long silence, he said, "But I was there. So yes, I share the guilt. My guilt is that I'm still here. I should have died." Then he motioned to Sereny that he had nothing more to say. Stangl, who was kept in solitary confinement, died 19 hours later of a heart attack. How had he gotten to that point? He started off a simple police officer. He was swiftly promoted to the Department of Criminal Investigations in a small Austrian town. In 1938, the Nazis asked him to renounce Catholicism and sign a declaration to that effect. In his eyes, that was an important stage towards his degeneration. He felt as if he had sold his soul. He was transferred to the town's Gestapo headquarters and then appointed in Berlin director of security of the Institute of the Action T412 plan, dedicated, as we've seen, to performing euthanasia on the mentally ill and the physically impaired. This program allowed the Nazis to test and perfect the techniques of mass elimination that they would use in the concentration camps. When Stangl learned of the nature of the work they expected of him, he tried to escape from it. And he said, "I was speechless. And then I finally said to them that I didn't really feel I was suited for this assignment. But his superior made him understand that his nomination was the proof of the exceptional trust they had placed in him and that he would not have to practice euthanasia himself. If he accepted, the disciplinary actions underway against him would be suspended." The chief of operations, Christian Wirth, nicknamed Christian the Savage, who would himself become director of the Balzac camp, declared scornfully that they had to do away with these useless people. With one thing leading to another, 4 years later in 1942, Stangl was sent to Poland and was entrusted with the construction of the Sobibor camp. One day, his superiors brought him to the Balzac camp, which was already active. He discovered the horror of the situation. There were trenches filled with decomposing bodies. Christian Wirth then told him that that was what Sobibor was going to become, and that he, Stangl, had been appointed director of it. Stangl replied again, he wasn't made for such a task, but there was no way out. With a friend, he discussed deserting and running away, but he abandoned that idea out of fear of failing and out of the fate that would then fall upon him, his wife, and children, who he loved above all else. During a visit to Sobibor, his wife ended up discovering what was going on in the camp. Horrified, she confronted her husband, who stated he wasn't involved in the atrocities being committed. And she said to him, "How can you be there and have nothing to do with this? You mean you don't see it happening?" To which he, trying to calm her, he replied, "Oh yes, I see it. But I don't do anything to anybody," adding that his work was purely administrative. Finally, he was appointed to the management of Treblinka. Treblinka, he said, was the most awful thing I saw during all of the Third Reich. And in saying this, he buried his face in his hands and he said it was straight out of Dante's Inferno. He went to find General Globnik, the chief of operations in Warsaw, and attempted unsuccessfully once again to withdraw from his assignment, saying he could not carry out orders. He then went on to see the new chief of police and begged to be transformed. All of this was in vain. Eventually, he got used to his macabre work, began drinking like most of his comrades, so as not to think too much about it, and carried out his task to the end. So what lesson can we draw from this tragic example? Michael Tereshchenko emphasizes this: the radical importance of refusing from the beginning, of not giving in to the slightest demand. Only this uncompromising refusal allows the moral integrity of the individual to be preserved as well as his freedom. Refusal does not imply that any particular order is called into question, but rather the authority from which it emanates. This is not an easy thing to do, Tereshchenko writes. Everyone easily dons the knight's armor, and when it costs only the price of a dream. But having returned to reality, the weight of things, the constraint of situations, the concerns of self-interest again make themselves felt, bogging us down in torpor and docile passivity. Rare are those who find in themselves the courage to extract themselves from it. Varlam Shalamov, who spent 17 years in the Gulag, warns us. If we leave the tops of our mountains, if we look for compromises, arrangements, pardons, it will all be over. If our conscience falls silent, we won't be able to resist the slippery slope. There have been, however, people who were able to say no. So I think what this story points to is how just regular people can fall down so low and do horrific things, and then they feel like out of weakness they can't do anything about it. And as bodhisattvas in training, we have to muster the courage to constantly be on guard for when we need to speak up, like now in this country, and any country that's in the state that we're in, and really speak out for the underdogs or the people who need speaking out for. And to actually maybe, when we're ready, to take risks that call us to do more. So let's continue to find ways of being skillful in our speaking out and to do it in ways that will be heard and to have others as the focus of our thinking.